This is The Lou Rockwell Show.
Well, it's great to have as our guest today Professor Roderick Long. Roderick teaches philosophy at Auburn University. He's a senior scholar of the Mises Institute, a famous libertarian. Take a look at his archive on Mises.org and also on LouRockwell.com. And Roderick, I don't want to accuse you of anything, but it's rumored that you're an anarchist. I mean, is that actually correct?
Yes. There is some truth to the rumor.
What does that mean?
Well, if the anarchist in this context is someone who wants to abolish the state, where the state is understood not as law and order. As an anarchist, I have no objection to law and order. I'd like to see more of it. But as the state is a territorial monopolist of law and order, just as a shoe monopolist could be someone who says, no one is allowed to make shoes except me, and I will decide what shoes you get and how much you pay for it. So a government is an institution that says, no one's allowed to produce any law and order except me in this area, and I will decide what kind of laws you get, what kind of order you get, and how much you pay for it. And if you don't like it, well, every 4 or 6 years you can, petition for some change in the personnel of my company.
It's a great description of the state. So, but of course, the state does more than just give us law and order here at home. They give us law and order all over the world. Yeah,
and well, I mean, think about it this way: if you are, if you're in a position where you are you're in a position where you control all these, all these weapons, you have all this power, and no one's allowed to compete with you. Well, then, you're in a position to do a heck of a lot of things you'd like to do. And of course, you'll probably try to describe these things as being in some way pursuant to what your goals are supposed to be. So if the function of the government is supposed to be protection of people's rights, which is what they often claim to be doing, then of course these other things they'll try to spin as protection of people's rights. But monopolies are in a position to abuse their power and to divert the resources they've acquired to various purposes, and so if they want to invade various countries, just like the invasion of Iraq, which was advertised as a defense of our rights, though it was never clear exactly how it was supposed to be. There was a suggestion that it had something to do with defending us against the 9/11 terrorists who were not from Iraq. Also, there was a suggestion that it was the defense of the Iraqi people's rights. They were going there to liberate them. And successfully, succeeded in liberating hundreds and thousands of them of their lives. But when you're a monopoly, you're in a position to do this because you don't have competition. If I were a shoe company and I started making shoes that had spikes on the inside of them that would poke at you, but those are the only shoes that people are allowed to have. Obviously, if another shoe company could come in and start having the shoes that didn't have spikes on the inside of them, then the shoe company would lose its ability to have any customers. But as long as the spikes aren't too sharp, that you're better off with that than going barefoot, people will put up with it.
What about the typical statist claim of public goods, that there are some things that are necessary to society that won't be produced in the private market, and so therefore you have to have the government to do it?
Yeah, well, the idea behind public goods is supposed to be that there are cases where, although it's in everyone's interest that a good be produced, it'll be produced whether any individual contributes to it or not, if it gets produced. And so people will just try to free ride in the production of the good, and therefore not enough people will contribute to it, and so it won't be produced, or it won't be produced in adequate quantities. There are a couple of problems with this argument. First is it ignores the fact that whenever you have a situation like that, you're creating an incentive for somebody, some entrepreneur or someone, to figure out a way to produce the good, because you have this profit opportunity that if there's something a lot of people want, but there's some problem with getting it produced, if you can figure out how to produce it, you stand to make a lot of money. And so when we actually look throughout history, you find that lots of things that are supposed to be public goods that there's no way of privately producing, people do manage to produce them privately, because people who stand to make a profit for it can often think up ways of doing it that someone sitting in their ivory tower can't. But the second problem with it is that it ignores the fact that government has another kind of incentive problem, which is, we might say, public choice problems, which is that when you're in a position to have a monopoly and abuse power, then there's no check on doing that, and so government has these sort of perverse incentival factors, plus perverse informational factors, where in the absence of competition, even if the government has good intentions, they're not, they have a hard time knowing whether they're doing the best thing. So we have to compare the so-called perversities of the market with the perversities of government, and then the perversities of the market, if you want to call them that, have a built-in correcting factor, which is that entrepreneurs stand to make a profit if they can figure out how to solve them, whereas government doesn't have this kind of inbuilt correcting factor because. Generally, the way things work in government is the more something fails, the more money it gets thrown at it. We hear, that our public schools are failing. We need to fund them more. In the market, when something does less well, it gets less money thrown at it, and things that do better get more money thrown at them. And that tends to encourage a better kind of incentive. But in government, the worse you do, the more money you get, and so it's no surprise that government's behaving competently.
Roderick, what were your intellectual influences? I mean, what helped bring you, not just in general, but helped bring you to these political and economic conclusions?
I was raised in a family that you might call sort of broadly old right, and sort of the conservative movement as it used to be, much more sort of an anti-state movement that was very skeptical of Roosevelt and that sort of thing. But I was growing up. As a kid, I was very unpolitical. I remember when I was in grade school, taking some kind of test of general knowledge, and I scored pretty high in everything except when it came to the political stuff. I had no idea who the Secretary of State was or anything like that. It was just sort of complete blank. Then in high school, I read Ayn Rand, and that was sort of the beginning of getting interested in libertarian ideas, although she was certainly not an anarchist, but a lot of people think that her ideas logically lead to anarchism, whether she recognized that or not. And then, it's sort of a typical way of getting involved in libertarianism is, we read her articles and you see various things that she refers to, and you go and read them, and you see various other things you refer to. So I ended up reading, Murray Rothbard and Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek and David Friedman and Friedrich Bastiat and, sort of the usual intellectual influences. It took me a fairly long time to become an anarchist, partly because one of the people I read that reading Rand had brought me to was Isabel Patterson. And Isabel Patterson has this argument that having a political structure is crucial to any kind of viable society. And she convinced me of that, and I think she was right about that, except that she thought, and therefore I thought, that having a political structure was inconsistent with anarchism. What I didn't realize is that anarchism is itself a political structure. It's checks and balances taken to its logical extreme. After all, some governments work better than others. The ones that tend to work better than others are the ones that have some sorts of checks and balances built into them, some ways in which it's harder for certain parts of the government to abuse power because other parts of the government have some sort of incentive to check them. Well, if you take that to its logical conclusion, you get the idea that if you want something, it's a way of sort of trying to reproduce competition into government. Well, then the logical extension of that is to extend competition broadly by allowing anyone to get into the business of providing legal services. So, but it took me a long time to realize that. So although I became a libertarian in some sense in 1979, I didn't really become an anarchist until 1991, something like that. Took me a long time. Read various things. Read Randy Barnett and Murray Rothbard and Bruce Benson, and looking at historical examples and theoretical arguments. And finally, it was actually during the first Gulf War that I finally flipped over. I just sort of enough already. And one of the things that happened was that I remember there was a news report that there was a situation of anarchy in Kuwait where the emir was unable to exercise power, but the Iraqi troops were gone, and there was a temporary period where the news reports were saying things were at least sort of temporarily self-organizing. It didn't last, but I remember just sort of being surprised by a reaction of thinking, "Hey, I wish that would last longer." And I thought, "Wait a second, I'm not an anarchist." And but why am I not an anarchist? And I think it was around that time that I finally made the leap.
We seem to have had this, what Murray Rothbard called a band of thieves writ large. The state hung around our necks through all of human history or all of known history. Have there been instances when that was not the case?
Yeah, there's never been there's never been a society of exactly of precisely the kind that libertarian anarchists advocate. But there certainly have been many societies that didn't have a monopoly state as we know it, and many of these societies did fairly well. In fact, there's a sense in which, and depending on exactly how you define the state, there's a sense in which there were very few states in early history, in the sense that, for example, most ancient societies